Okay, look around your workplace. There's probably someone you'd label a perfectionist. You may also know someone you at least suspect of being a narcissist, completely self-absorbed. Well, it turns out those two traits can show up in the same person. That's according to new findings from Dalhousie University's personality research team. They also found, surprise, these kinds of people can be extremely difficult. Simon Sherry teaches psychology at Dalhousie and leads the personality research team.
Hi, Simon.
Hello.
Name one, just so we get a sense of what you're talking about. A narcissistic perfectionist.
Steve Jobs.
What traits did he possess to qualify for that?
If you look at biographies, there's a clear pattern in Jobs' interpersonal functioning that I think distinguishes him as a narcissistic perfectionist. He's grandiose. He has a great sense of self-importance. He's entitled. He believes he's owed special treatment. And in particular, for Steve Jobs, he's someone who demands perfection of other people, and he is relentlessly critical of those around him.
What comes first, the chicken or the egg here? Because Steve Jobs looks at his body of work and goes, yep, I did that. And then develops that personality, or he had that personality when he was in the garage making that first computer?
He had that personality when he was in the garage making that first computer, and his father was looking over his shoulder, telling him that not only should his electronic devices look and be perfect on the outside, they also needed to be perfect on the inside. So even though the public would never see, he wanted the arrangements of the various boards of electronics to be perfect. It takes a lot of coaching to rear a narcissistic perfectionist, and Jobs had the right sort of tutelage from his father.
Nature or nurture? Did you start out that way, or do you get to be that way?
The answer is both. There's a collision between nature and nurture. Something like narcissism or perfectionism rests on a bedrock of behavior genetics. About 40 to 50% of narcissistic perfectionism could be explained by inheritance. It's in your genes. But it also takes the contribution of nurture. Certain sort of environments, maybe early parental environments, seem conducive to creating a narcissistic perfectionist. You're going to come from a home wherein you're pedestalized, wherein you're overly important in the household. Mom and dad are going to praise you and treat you like a prince or a princess, and that fuels that entitlement and that grandiosity I mentioned earlier.
Certainly not at Dalhousie University, and certainly not at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. But are there narcissistic perfectionists amongst us here?
Absolutely. You can run into narcissistic perfectionists on a day-to-day basis. In fact, a lot of this research is driven by my own work as a clinical psychologist. It's not uncommon for me to treat someone who might be a narcissistic perfectionist. Typically, these individuals don't present to therapy because, after all, they believe that they're perfect. But they do present to therapy when someone or something has deflated their grandiosity, when life has, in effect, burst their bubble. They may not have received a promotion at work. They may have gotten into difficulty with an employer. These are not uncommon presenting conditions. There's usually an element of external force, if not a requirement, that they show up to therapy. Now, another impetus for this work would come from a different sort of clinical presentation, and this is someone who would show up in my office when I'm doing my work as a clinical psychologist who has been hurt by, who has been negatively impacted by a narcissistic perfectionist. And it is our working hypothesis at the personality research team that proximity to a narcissistic perfectionist is hurtful. It damages you. And if you find yourself in an involuntary sort of relationship with a narcissistic perfectionist,
like working for one?
Absolutely, where you may not be able to leave because of economic requirements, or married to one would be another example. These are not relationships that one can easily exit. Then there's accumulated negative consequences of facing the grandiose and lofty demands of a narcissistic perfectionist on a day-to-day basis.
What's the prognosis for somebody who has a pretty marked case of it, shows up because he or she was required to do so. And they choose you because of your research background. So, okay, good luck with this, Simon. What's the prognosis for that person?
We couldn't give you an exact scientific answer. There's a huge gap in knowledge when it comes to the treatment of narcissism and perfectionism, and especially where these two personality traits overlap in the narcissistic perfectionism area. I would have to say, though, the prognosis is fairly bleak. And that is another key reason why we're undertaking this research. We need to better understand narcissistic perfectionists, and we need to have better assessment tools and ultimately better interventions to help these individuals. You can find more than 120 years of speculation, clinical observations, theoretical accounts talking about narcissistic perfectionists, but it's really only been our research lab within the last year or two that's actually started to quantify, to actually empirically study some of that speculation. So one key reason why we're undertaking this research is to provide better assessments, to provide better interventions down the road.
It probably is a question better asked in the beginning than the end, but what is your personality as distinct of, from your sense of self, how other people perceive you? From a clinical point of view, how do you define what someone's personality is?
That's a great question, and it's very relevant to our conversation here today because we see narcissistic perfectionism as a personality trait. And a personality trait is something that's grounded in your genetic inheritance. It's shaped by early experience. And by the time you're around age 30, it's going to be a fixed, enduring characteristic. Some people would even argue that your personality follows you more or less from womb to tomb, that it's a life course, persistent aspect of who you are. And personality is all about uniqueness. What makes person A different from person B?
It's fascinating. We'll maybe have you back when the research is a little further down the road. It's very nice to talk to you. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Simon Sherry teaches in Dalhousie University's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience.